Now, joining me in the studio is Dan Perry, former Europe and Middle East editor for the Associated Press. Dan, Hamas reportedly agreeing to the request of Israel to ask for these 11 males to be added to the list of hostages who will be released in the first phase. And in return, they're asking for more compensation. What could that look like? What can we expect them to be asking for?
I think they're asking for prisoners, basically, and high-quality prisoners from their perspective. And also the timing of the phases, the length of the phases, Philadelphia corridor, and things of that nature. The main discourse in Israel is whether Israel could have possibly done more to go for an everyone for everything deal where all the hostages are returned, because, as you heard in the report, there is a strong concern, a very valid concern, that the first phase may be the only phase. Because Hamas will retain some prisoners in its hands, or in Islamic Jihad hands, with which to bargain for an end to the war. And Netanyahu has made very clear, including over the weekend in a Wall Street Journal interview, note that he is only interviewed in a Wall Street Journal and foreign media and not really in Israeli media. He made clear that that he will not agree to an end to the war until Hamas is out of power, which makes a lot of sense, because most Israelis want all the hostages back, but they also don't want to leave Hamas in power. That sounds like a recipe for disaster. But where the plot thickens is that many people in Israel believe that Israel itself has engineered a situation where if it leaves Gaza, Hamas remains in power, because Netanyahu has an interest in a forever war for political reasons. Yes.
Right, well, we'll get back to that, but I want to bring into the conversation now Gidi Grinstein, a former peace negotiator under Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak and founder of the Reut Group. Now, we're hearing more and more details of the deal, but a lot is still unconfirmed, of course. And what does seem clear, though, is that we're looking at a deal in phases. And as someone with experience in the field of negotiating, what does that tell you about the chances for, one, Israel getting back all the hostages, and two, the ceasefire actually holding throughout the three phases?
First of all, thank you very much for having me on your show. I believe that obviously right now we're converging into a partial deal, meaning some of the hostages will be released. They're talking about in the range of 30 to 40 hostages in exchange for a few hundred of Palestinian prisoners, including what we call some heavyweights, meaning people that were convicted and sentenced to life imprisonment. Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, is actually signaling to the Arab side, to the Qataris, to the Egyptians, to the Hamas, that he has no intention of ending the war. And therefore, the Hamas has no intention of actually doing a comprehensive deal. And as Dan Perry said earlier, the plot thickens not only in the sense that that Israel has not made it clear what it wants in Gaza, but Israel has not introduced a single alternative to the Hamas government in Gaza, meaning Israel, the only possible alternative to the control of Hamas in Gaza is the Palestinian Authority. And Israel, Netanyahu, has actually blocked out the Palestinian Authority and has not taken the steps to prepare the Palestinian Authority for taking over and governing Gaza. There's also signaling that is happening between the leaders, which is what happened last weekend, as Dan Perry described, through the Wall Street Journal. Netanyahu is communicating with the Arab side above the head of the negotiators, signaling to them his red lines. So there could be that there is technical rapprochement in the positions, meaning the number of prisoners that will be exchanged, the number of hostages will be released, all sorts of security arrangements, perhaps the movement of Palestinian population to some areas in the northern Gaza, although some of them are biblically destroyed in terms of the biblical in terms of the level of destruction there, and it's not livable. At the same time, there are the political signaling that has been going on, as I mentioned earlier, in which Netanyahu makes it very complicated for the Palestinian side to agree for a deal when he vows to continue the war. Certainly, it prevents the prospects of a comprehensive deal.
All right. Gidi Grinstein, thank you very much for your analysis and your input tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Still with me in the studio is Dan Perry. You mentioned this earlier. We just heard Gidi Grinstein mention it, the interview that Benjamin Netanyahu did with the Wall Street Journal, where he said that there is not going to be a deal if Israel has to end the war. Israel is going to continue the war. We know that Hamas has said that at least some sort of commitment from Israel of ending the war, it has to be present. And now Netanyahu's political rivals, his critics, are saying that he's trying to blow the deal, that he's not actually interested in the deal. What are your thoughts on the situation right now?
I wrestle with my own desire not to sound too cynical and not to ascribe to Netanyahu motivations and strategies that would be morally reprehensible. But the suspicion in much of Israel is that Netanyahu has a need to prolong the war in order to, A, keep his government afloat, because an end to the war on terms unacceptable to the right wing, the far right, and the right wing wants to occupy Gaza and resettle it, would bring down his government. And two, an end to the war would end this paradigm, would end the applicability of the paradigm where Netanyahu says, well, yeah, October 7th was a horrible debacle and we need to investigate it, but only after the war. That obviously incentivizes a forever war. Now, do I really think the Prime Minister of Israel, because of that situation, is willing to prolong the war in a way that condemns hostages to death and will cause, therefore, needlessly, the death of more soldiers and Palestinian Gazans? I mean, that would be wrong. But I tell you, at least half of Israel thinks that's what's going on, and that's a very unhealthy situation karmically. I don't want to believe it's so, but it's hard to otherwise explain why what's happening is happening.
Right.
It's not just that Israel has refused to create the foundations for a day after Hamas in Gaza, but also Israel's on the ground. Israel's military is not acting like the eradication of Hamas is imminent. They've settled in for what looks to be a long-term insurgency, not unlike what the Americans faced in Iraq. So when Netanyahu says, we won't end the war until Hamas is crushed, but does nothing to actually crush Hamas, it kind of looks like he's going for forever war. And Hamas will not release its final hostages until the war is over. So what should be done is precisely what Gidi said, and more. I mean, Israel should long ago, we're a year and 2 months into the war. Long ago, Israel should have said, this is the deal. Palestinian Authority needs to go back in, but not in its current constitution, but with reforms and with the assistance of the Arab world and with international backing. And we're going to do all this great stuff that will bring in a global backing for reconstruction of Gaza and create a positive narrative that will create tremendous pressure on the remnants of Hamas to essentially surrender. And probably it needed to put on the table a plan to allow what remains of Hamas to leave Gaza and go someplace that likes them, maybe Turkey, maybe Qatar. None of this was done, none of it. And I repeat, the tactics on the ground are cat and mouse games with an insurrection. So Israel, that knew how to take out Hezbollah when it wanted to, because it has no political complication there, and knew how to make a deal, and knows how to win Nobel Prizes and be a global leader in almost every realm. Is what you're saying. It kind of looks like they're not trying to create the circumstances on the ground that would enable an end to the war, and that is dispiriting, it's shocking, and it is at the core of what is right now in Israel just horrible and toxic bad karma, where what remains of this government, supported about a third of the people, are at real loggerheads with the 70% or so that notice something is off and want a paradigm shift.
All right, Dan Perry, stay with us. We'll talk more about this later in the show. Now, at least 16 people were lightly wounded in Tel Aviv early Saturday morning when a missile launched by Iranian-backed Houthis in Yemen made a direct impact. Israel's air defenses failed to intercept the missile. Meanwhile, the Houthis are showing no signs of backing down anytime soon, and the U.S. struck a missile storage facility and a Houthi command center overnight in Yemen's capital, Sana'a. The Houthis are emerging as the last standing and active and very effective, really, proxy of Iran against Israel. Are we likely to see Iran upping any sort of support for them? Are we likely to see them rearming more and becoming a stronger enemy?
Far be it for me to predict the actions of Iran. But it seems unlikely, because the Iranian regime appears to know that it's becoming increasingly unpopular. And there are voices in Iran itself criticizing the government for all the money they threw down the toilet in the case of Syria, and also Hezbollah for no purpose, while the Iranian currency has devalued to the point of something shocking that approaches what was the case in Zimbabwe a few years ago, about 1,000% or something. And the Iranian president and supreme leader are currently calling for Iranians to use less electricity. I mean, they have a real crisis in Iran. I can't see them spending more money on the Houthis when they're being hammered for what they spent on Hezbollah and in Syria. But then again, it's Iran. So the same country has ridiculously just increased the amount of highly enriched uranium processing that it does in order to maximize some leverage against the UN nuclear agency. So they're not necessarily so rational.
And looking at the Houthis, they're a very ideologically driven group. How much of a danger do they pose? Do you see them posing for Israel, even if a ceasefire with Gaza is reached?
I would imagine that if a ceasefire with Gaza is reached, or if an end to the war is reached, then they'll declare some kind of victory, claim part of the credit for it, and probably stop firing missiles. But as we discussed before, a true and full end to the Gaza war may be a very long while off. They clearly feel, the Houthis feel, some political advantage in Yemen itself, where they have utterly failed to provide any succor to the people who are dying of cholera and starvation. And there is seemingly a significant part of the population there that can be manipulated through tales of glory in the fight against the Jews and the Zionists. Are they rational enough to be de-incentivized if they were to be truly crushed by military force? I suspect so. But the record is not that great in this regard, because the Saudis kind of tried it for about 6 or 7 years, and in the end kind of sort of walked away with tail between legs. But it does seem outrageous for the global community to more or less normalize and accept a situation where a quarter or more of global container traffic is being impeded by Houthi attacks in solidarity with the Palestinians, let us say, but also just against the West, causing tremendous damage to Egypt that can ill afford to lose billions of dollars in Suez Canal revenue.
And not just Egypt. I mean, Houthis are really emerging as a player to be taken seriously in this. All right, Dan?
This should end, and it probably needs to end by force.
Dan, we spoke of some of the different international players. I'd like to bring you in on Israel and Israel's role in all of this. We know that al-Shura has come out and said that he's not looking for war. He is looking for good relations with his neighbors. He is willing to respect the ceasefire deal that has existed for 5 decades by now. Meanwhile, he's also saying that he would like Israel to return to its positions from before the takeover. Now, Israel is not doing that. It's actually doing the opposite. We have a presence in the buffer zone, and also on a few locations apart from that. And this is being seen by many in the Middle East, in particular, also internationally, as a land grab, very active land grab, as a provocation. Is Israel's argument that they're simply doing this for defense purposes and for temporary purposes, are these arguments still relevant? Do they still seem likely?
I think Israel's argument is defensible as long as they are true to their word that once the situation calms in Syria and Israel can be certain that it won't be attacked from the high ground that it has seized on the Syrian Hermon, for example, and other strategic positions, then it returns. I mean, Israel has said it will, and Israel's
yes, but it has said it will. I mean,
Israel's ambivalent view towards HTS and Ahmed al-Shara is not indefensible. It is shared by the entire West. So much depends on whether the new leader of Syria, and it seems it will be him, emerges as more of an Islamist, and they have a record of being anti-Western and anti-Israel, or more of a patriotic Syrian that may perhaps want to change everything about the reality in this region and surprise everyone with an inclusive government, the way he's actually promised, that isn't hostile towards Israel. That would change everything. I think in this case, Israel's being on the fence and being cautious about what it does is as I say, not indefensible. Now, of course, Israel has a bad track record in the eyes of the region when it comes to taking territory temporarily, which is what Israel said it was doing in 1967 with the West Bank and Gaza. But honestly, the criticism of Israel for taking a few square kilometers, well, maybe not a few, but a few hundred square kilometers in Syria, when Turkey essentially has occupied a lot more and has killed a lot of people in so doing and has embroiled itself in great violence and disruption in Syria, it's hypocrisy. And I think Israel needs to wait it out.
What do you think is the likelihood of the ceasefire with Hezbollah lasting longer than the 60 days?
Well, this time it seems that it is more serious. I mean, all the political factions have decided to circumvent the Hezbollah's, the positions and all his trying to undermine this agreement. Right now, I think the Hezbollah is trying to fight for its own survival politically and militarily, and this is a situation that was never felt in the past in Lebanon, and this creates a great possibility that things could be. I mean, it could finally be on the positive side concerning Israel, and this is very important.
All right, Jacques Naria, thank you so much for joining us tonight, for your analysis and input.
Thank you.
Now, still with me in the studio is Dan Perry. We mentioned this here, a potential for Lebanon to clean up a little bit, get some things in order domestically. Is there a chance for an opportunity for Israel here?
Absolutely. Israel has no claim on any part of Lebanon. The Israeli people have no enmity towards the Lebanese people. Israel, 40 years ago, almost tried to impose a peace treaty on Lebanon by engineering the Gemayel family's ascension to the presidency, and that didn't work out because Syria vetoed it, essentially. Now look at what we've seen in the past year. Nasrallah, who had been the head of Hezbollah, who had been de facto the ruler of Lebanon, is gone. The Syrian regime that had allowed its territory to be a superhighway for arming Hezbollah from Iran and Iraq is gone. And Iran itself has been severely weakened, clearly cowed, and dealing with a domestic disaster area, basically, and perhaps is less inclined to try to meddle not only in Syria, which it can't anymore, but in Lebanon. It no longer has a land route to Lebanon, for one thing. So Hezbollah is very much weakened, even beyond its physical degradation at the hands of Israel. Now, Lebanon had been, all parts of Lebanese society had been very much acquiescent to the domination of their country by Hezbollah, and I think they smell blood, and they want Hezbollah gone. And the real question will be now whether Joseph Aoun, who, as Jacques just mentioned, has designs on a presidency in a few weeks, moves decisively to deny Hezbollah any remaining foothold, or to the degree that he can, further footholds in Lebanon. Certainly weapons depots, he shouldn't allow them. Certainly a role in securing the country's borders, which they actually claimed once to be doing, should not be allowed to them. It's a good sign that the Lebanese army has taken over these Palestinian bases, or many will be surprised they even existed. But the key is going to be for the Lebanese army to take over the borders of Lebanon and to begin the arduous task of disarming Hezbollah. This is the great unsaid, because the ceasefire agreement contains within it, if you look at the UN Security Council resolutions that it references, the demand that Hezbollah disarm, which is a basic thing. When a sovereign country has sovereignty, they don't want militias existing in the country claiming to protect its sovereignty. You have to have one army, and the signs, as Jacques said, are pretty good. We'll see in coming weeks.
All right, so you're saying the signs are pretty good. It's been quite clear that recently we're seeing a lot of factors, different groups, different countries around Israel sort of fall into place for Israel to do something with it.
Yes.
What is, in your opinion, the likelihood that Israel is actually going to be able to take this opportunity of a potential ceasefire with Hamas, weakened Hezbollah, weakened Iran, a new beginning in Syria, possibly a new beginning in Lebanon, for Israel to actually do something with this? And as long as it continues the war in Gaza, that seems just impossible.
A lot of the good things that could happen depend on a series of tripwires that begin with resolving the Palestinian issue. And the problem is the current government basically stands for a school of thought that says the Palestinian issue can be basically shoved to one side. And even the Saudis will make peace with Israel with on the Palestinian side. And that simply will not happen. Now, Israel can probably collect some dividends of its military success, for example, with Lebanon and vis-a-vis the changes in Syria, for sure, even without a change in government. But for Israel to truly enter a new strategic phase where it has an alliance with the moderate Arab countries, and maybe even Syria and Lebanon join the ranks of those moderate Arab countries, that requires a political change in Israel, and to no longer have a government that plays these games, as we've seen, with prolonging the war in Gaza, and has a government that understands that even if full Palestinian independence is not possible in the coming years, probably, a process leading to a separation from the Palestinians and their emancipation from Israeli occupation has to be part of that establishment of a new regional reality. I think it is possible. It'll require, at the very least, a unity government in Israel that frees the current leadership of its dependence on the far right. Quite possibly, it requires a whole new government.
All right, Dan Perry, thank you very much for joining us here tonight throughout the Middle East Now.
My pleasure.